So here we are in a rainy cab in Mexico talking about the end of the world, right? Anyway, so we're talking about end of time and all these kind of concepts. I guess my big question that I always wonder is that in all these discussions people talk about like transformational energy or like the energy that's going to come through, and you sort of talk about that a little bit. I mean, with the sort of like the alignment that's going to open up this channel or conduit through like the Pleiades and the Galactic Center. Do you have any kind of insight as to like what kind of energy that might be? I mean, it's, you know what I mean? Because I think we must be careful when it's like certain people say like the galactic beam, and what is that?
Well, that's sort of a a sci-fi notion. The evolutionary energy really resides at the root of our spines. That is, the idea is that with the galactic alignment, there's a resonation that's taking place between the microcosm and the macrocosm.
Oh, okay, so it's like the universe's Kundalini chakra is resonating with our Kundalini chakra, like it's base root chakra.
You might say it that way. We don't have to get lost in trying to make too much of a scientific analogy with it.
Okay.
It's just that there's more energy available, there's more energy coming into the Earth system, and that can cause great stress unless we are processing the energy in a way that's healthy. If we're, sort of channeling the energy into the positive, into positive work, the positive work being transformation.
Now, okay, this actually, not to get on too much of an aside, but this is important because I've heard that like people who are highly creative, like creative geniuses throughout history, that they've had like bouts of like great illnesses too, because when you have so much energy, if you don't let it flow, you get like blockages, right?
Right.
So could that be something then that like all of us are kind of having to deal with because we are all so bombarded with this energy that
that's probably a good way to think about it. There's of course a lot of depression.
Yeah, or people can't sleep at night and all sorts of stuff.
I think in many cases depression is suppression. Whether it's because we live in a highly inhibited culture or we ourselves suffer from inhibitions or whatever. Depression is sort of like pushing down the energy, and there's all kinds of other neuroses in our culture too. So I think that a lot of this is around us being encouraged to not live up to our full potential, to not being larger conduits of a creative process, the transformative process being directed towards the unfolding of our true selves.
So it's like right now we're being bombarded with sort of this impetus to do so, to become our greatest selves we can be.
Right.
And then we're also getting this huge kind of restriction trying to pull us away from that. And so of course people are getting depressed and angst and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Okay.
There's conflicting notions, there's conflicting energies going on here.
It's like dad tells you yes, mom tells you no, and you're like,
yeah, exactly. The universe is encouraging us to wake up, but our culture is encouraging us to stay asleep.
So, then to get back to that kind of, like when you said like, there's more energy, but I just always wonder like what kind of energy, because I'm like, I want to kind of search for this one guy, I think his name's like John Burke or something, I'm not sure his name, but he's done all this research on like electromagnetic energy and how it can, affect people's IQs and consciousness, and how when they're bombarded with higher amounts, their IQs increase and stuff. I mean, do you have any insight into what exactly kind of energy it would be that's being, kind
of... one could talk about electromagnetics and our angular orientation to the fields of force inside the galaxy and so on. Maybe this would lead to a kind of scientific model of how the galactic alignments do stimulate, things on Earth.
Earth changes, like everyone, a lot of people put that theory forward as well.
But I think that on a spiritual level, it's, I sort of steer clear of that because it turns it into sort of a mechanistic sort of model, that it's about energy happening to us. Because again, the key to the whole thing is that we open up to a new, larger perspective. So it's really about space. It's about consciousness and the space that consciousness can create. When consciousness opens, it expands. Consciousness can create a larger container such that we can directly perceive more deeply how the universe works.
So you're saying that like it's kind of it sort of doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter the mechanism exactly how it works, like whether we label. I guess because it's like thingism to label exactly what it is, because what you're saying is we know from these traditions enough that as it is out there in the galaxy is mirrored what's happening here on Earth. So you know that like whether or not we know exactly how it happens, right? Is that kind of
it's not going to help us any to get stuck in the details of. I mean, some people might want to do that in terms of creating a model by which these things might work.
I think it helps a lot of people stuck in this sort of scientific framework of labeling things to like kind of go there and believe it when they do. You know, because it's like, oh, okay, well, if you can prove it on paper, but I mean, you know, that's a never-ending slope right there of, you know, because, you know, well, if you can prove God exists to me on paper,
well, this is Cacahoatan, so
right.
I'm surprised at how quick it is to get here. We might opt to go up to Union Juarez. It's only another, what would it be, 12 miles. It seems like as we talk, we get deeper and deeper into the controversies or the nuanced aspects of the whole discussion, which is hard to sort of avoid. People want sort of quick pan answers, but the nature of this discussion is that a deeper meditation on it, it's not about complexity. It's not that it's an essentially complex thing.
Right.
It's just that it requires that a person invest their own energy and commitment to going deeper into some universal spiritual questions.
Mm-hmm. I'm just kind of trying to just like sort of pick the whole thing apart so that it's like sort of bare for the naked, you know, like truth.
Now, if you go out and interview people that are involved in this discussion, you're going to get the whole spectrum. There's something about this topic that there's a large spectrum and a big multiplicity. There's a great multiplicity of ideas that are dancing around this. And so one of the lessons in all of this might be the idea of unity in multiplicity. You know, an acceptance of just a huge, you know, free for all. At least on the level of what the culture is doing with it. It's unavoidable. My preference, my hope, would be that we can make the Maya perspective central. Because after all, this date comes to us from the Maya tradition.
That's the key point I was trying to get, like, been getting at for like a long time, is that there's so much that people have to say about this date. But would this date come to us through any other source than the Maya?
Hold on 1 second before he answers that. One thing to consider is that the galactic alignment is really the key to understanding the reason why the Maya put this calendar in place. Now, if we really understand the science behind the galactic alignment, we can understand that it is a factual thing. The galactic alignment does happen. It's a fact of astronomy. There are many other theories, including, say, for example, the binary star hypothesis, which is highly speculative, and there may be some evidence that comes into play in the future that will prove that theory, but right now, it's not a known thing. We do know that the galactic alignment happens.
It's a fact, okay.
So that is the de facto science behind this thing that we call the 2012 phenomena.
Okay, and but like, my question is, just to be direct to the point, there are several cultures at least, maybe many, that point to this galactic alignment, that have imagery or traditions that kind of discuss or show it.
Right.
Did any other culture besides the culture at Azapa and then the Mayans after them put a date on it?
It does not seem to be, no. It seems to be that only the Maya had, you know, created an entire calendar that points to a specific date that indicates this galactic alignment.
So then, I guess, in my mind, would it be fair, therefore, to say that anyone that has a significant theory on what is or is not going to happen on 2012, that if they do not include, basically, information grounded, I guess, in Mayan history and mythology, that it's kind of, I guess, not very pertinent?
No, I mean,
Well, look at the light. Or if it encompasses bits of information that come from other traditions that talk of the galactic alignment, is it fair to say, well, this is supposed to happen on the galactic alignment, which fortunately the Maya gave us a date to? I mean, is that kind of where they come from, or?
Well, it'd be nice if they would acknowledge and recognize what the Maya have to say about 2012, and understand how that information comes through the Maya creation mythology. See, it's very, very murky in the collective discussion right now. There's a lot of talk about, oh, the Maya didn't say anything about 2012. That's one of the main sort of mistaken critiques around this whole discussion. And yet we have this creation mythology that is part of a world age doctrine.
Specifically addressing it, right?
Oh, that's the other way.
Got
it. We get high into the mountains here. This will be kind of neat.
We're climbing the mountains with John Major Jenkins.
So there are traditions that have spiritual teachings that are based upon the cyclic processes of time and notions about what happens at the end of cycles and the ideas of spiritual transformation and transcendence that are attached to that. And some of these traditions do seem to be referencing the galactic alignment process, but it's only the Maya calendar that pinpoints a specific date. Now, a lot of people are talking about 2012, but they're not referencing the information that is available to talk about with the Maya tradition, like the creation mythology and so on.
So that just means they're coming up with their own theories and then just attaching it to an upcoming date, right? I mean,
a lot of times that happens, and that's fairly disingenuous, and there's really no reason for that, because we do have information that can be accessed about the Maya traditions. In other words, it's kind of like, one of the difficult things in this is that there aren't a lot of people that really understand how the Maya creation mythology speaks to the astronomy that culminates in 2012. The Maya creation mythology basically encodes the astronomical process that culminates in 2012. That's one of the things it does. It also provides spiritual teachings and a prophecy for the end of the cycle.
Right.
It's a world age doctrine, so it's all about cycles and the end of cycles and the various world ages that humanity passes through.
Now, you know how the Vedic texts, I suppose, is that how you say them?
Yeah.
Spoke about the Yuga cycles, and there's kind of this Silver Age and this Bronze Age. We're talking about, so if we look at the Vedic kind of texts that talk about the world ages, and they talk about, this Dark Age, the Bronze Age, the Silver Age, the Golden Age, did the Mayans have a kind of similar view on the cyclic nature of time? There was like ages broken up like that, or was it a bit different than that?
It was very similar to the Vedic Yuga doctrine. When you really understand the basis of the Vedic Yuga doctrine, it is connected to precession. And apparently, though, the Maya divided the precession cycle into 5 world ages, whereas the Vedic would divide it into 4 descending and 4 ascending. So there's really 8 ages in the full cycle. But they're sort of like mirror image reflections of the same thing. So there's really 4. There's basically what we call the Golden Age, and the Silver Age, and the Bronze Age, and then the Iron Age. The Iron Age is the age of greatest spiritual darkness.
And what was the one that the Mayans added on to it that wasn't there before in the?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that, because in the Maya divisions of space, the way that they would do that is sort of like a square with the 4 corners. So those would be 4 world ages around the 4 corners, and the 5th world age would be in the center. So the 5th age is the age of space or movement, which is the age that we're in right now. Movement or space basically embraces or encapsulates all the previous ages.
Now, I've heard all this stuff that the Mayans said that each age ends with a cataclysm, that they said that there's been 5 previous worlds, or that 4 previous worlds, and we're entering the 5th, and one was destroyed with a flood and one with fire. I mean, do you know about that, or do you ascribe or give any kind of credence to that at all? Or
well, you do find that in the Maya creation myth, except it really depends on the emphasis with which things are interpreted.
No necesitamos fue rápido.
So it depends on the emphasis with which things are interpreted. there's a tendency in our modern world to sort of go for the jugular with the most fantastic, drama associated with it. In the Maya creation myth, for example, there are previous world ages that have ended, and the emphasis, though, is on transformation and renewal.
Right.
See, this is really, it's not really a technicality. It's really very important. Like, is the cup half full or is it half empty? And our culture apparently tends to like to emphasize that the cup is half empty.
Right.
Where
okay,
the Maya
okay.
emphasis is more on the ultimate outcome of the process, which is transformation and renewal.
Okay, so you're talking about the same things that those other people are talking about, but you're just saying that it's more like the Yuga doctrine of like that there's these cycles in time, and it's not like that there was, Lumeria and it was
Sure.
destroyed by fire. I
Well,
mean,
it's a free will choice to see it one way or the other.
but it's the same info.
It's coming from the same info. One is basically a willful decision to be essentially negative,
Yeah.
and the other is a willful decision to be essentially positive.
Okay. So you're just saying kind of from and I mean I think as you've sort of pointed out before, the Mayans had a tendency to look in kind of a positive light at most things. I mean, they were highly spiritual, right?
Well, the positive perspective in this case is actually the perspective that emerges when you look at the whole thing. If you look at the end of a cycle
That's funny.
and then close your eyes to the full process, you're not going to see the ultimate outcome, which is transformation and renewal.
Right.
So the apocalypse will be true to the extent that you don't look deeply enough at the material.
Okay. And do you think that might be a metaphor for what's going to happen coming up with people? That like some people it's going to be a really great time with lots of opportunities, and other people are going to be like, man, the early 2000s sucked, I mean...
Sure, that's a great way to look at it. I mean, there's some very inspiring and impressive things that are going on in the sustainable living movement with people, good old inventive, sort of innovative qualities of creativity and developing new resources, new sources of fuel, and not only that, but a kind of culturally creative shift in the way that we do things. Like we're moving, some very creative people where I live in Colorado are doing community farms, and it's building community and coming back to what's human about, having a culture. What is our culture? It's a bunch of atoms looking at TVs from different living rooms.
That's true. Do you, we kind of talked about this personally. I don't know if we were on camera when we did, but do you personally think that there was no, we did on camera, like that there were higher world ages with like actual big civilizations that were in connection with each other, like Atlantis? Have you ever seen this evidence that Graham Hancock and William Henry put forth that show remarkable coincidences between Mayan culture and Egyptian culture? Like their pyramids are the same, they have the same headdress and same murals and stuff.
Well, I believe that there were previous cycles of civilization, and we see fragments and echoes of this, either in the deep waters of the ocean or even in South America. There's some, stone temples there at Tiahuanaco that are very interesting, and the fact is we just have no way of dating these, really. But they may be very, very old.
Especially if they're submerged underwater, right?
Well, sure. I mean, if they're submerged underwater, there's a good indication, because then you'd have to look at the geological record to see when that spot was above water, And actually, some of these places that Graham Hancock has looked at, weren't above water until after like 12,000 years ago.
Right. Especially those ones off Japan, which they're so big that people doubt they're even real because they're so mammoth.
Right.
So then I guess the big question that I have that I've been trying to run down through all of this, because I mean, and I didn't know this before I went to the site of Azapa, and my opinion's kind of changed, but is it possible that this complex information that the Mayans had about their calendar, that it maybe came from a higher prior knowledge or civilization that got kind of trickled down? I mean, is that possible?
I suppose it's possible, but I don't particularly ascribe to that idea, because then that implies that the Maya themselves were just sort of like receiving information from Egyptians or Atlantean coming off of boats. I think that's fairly disingenuous to the innate genius that the Maya exhibit. I think that what one could say is that all of these ancient cultures were drawing from the same higher transcendent wisdom,
Yeah.
and that's why you get similar patterns in their architecture and their cosmologies, because they were drawing their information either from sky patterns, sky cycles, or the universal principles of sacred geometry.
Well, I really now seeing the site. I mean, that like makes a lot of sense to me, because it does not look like Azapa is the site of, like, you know, Atlantis or something like that. You know, I mean, it's river stones cobbled together with, I mean,
Right.
an interesting type of mortar they made, but I mean, it's nothing, you know, jaw-dropping or awe-inspiring. I mean, humans today could easily make it, you know.
Well, I think Azapa is protecting itself from sort of like pop culture by not having any huge pyramids.
Yeah.
And it's kind of off the beaten track, so it's sort of hard to get to, and you really have to be committed to getting there. And then once you get there, there's not these huge monstrous stone pyramids that you can climb all over.
But I mean, those are around in Mexico, correct?
Oh, yeah.
Palenque and stuff, and,
Sure,
and that's
sure.
where a lot of people get the. So it's interesting to me, though, that of all places that the calendar could have come from, that people associate with Atlantis, it comes from like the most primitive. And I guess my only question then, the last question then, is it that they weren't just receiving information from
Oh,
Atlanteans
man.
getting off boats?
Jeez, it's like Dogland, USA.
Something's dead there or something they're eating. God, they look messed up.
Santo Domingo.
I guess the question is it not that they were getting information from Atlanteans coming off boats, but they are, you know, I mean, 13,000 years ago is a long period of time, so is it more like the Atlanteans got off the boat, they tried to keep civilization together, and 5,000 years, 10,000 years after that,
Yeah.
their remnants were now the Azapans, who kind of were still, you know, had a little bit of this foreknowledge passed down for 10,000 years orally, and they're like kind of piecing it back together. I mean, is that possible? I mean, yeah, I'm sure anything's possible.
I don't know. It's hard to say. The whole myth of Atlantis, I think, is a metaphor for the movements of the sky.
Really? That's interesting. Okay, let's talk about
Well,
that.
I have a chapter in my book Galactic Alignment that goes into this. Sort of in a nutshell, the idea, you know, drawing from certain philosophers like René Guénon and other people that I've written about, there definitely seems to be two kind of traditions in ancient history. This is part of a kind of esoteric history of mankind. One is Hyperborean or northern, and the other is Atlantean or southern. And I believe that this refers to the polar orientation versus the galactic orientation, because the galaxy, the galactic center actually moves through the southern skies as viewed from the northern hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
So you have this polarity, and you see this at Azapa between Seven Macaw, the northern polar deity, and Hunahpu, the southern galactic deity, this dialectic that we saw in Stela 25 in the museum. Now, Atlantis would be connected with the southern Atlantean or galactic tradition.
Wow.
The whole thing that Plato describes with the rings around Atlantis and how it's described a certain way in the Timaeus that Plato wrote seems to me to be possibly the idea of the nuclear bulge of the galactic center. But when he says that Atlantis started sinking, basically it would be 12,800 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
That's half a precession cycle. Now,
So that's when probably the Milky Way started dipping, right?
well, that's what happened. There's a movement in the sky that's caused by precession, and it's basically that something on the ecliptic, like for example the galactic center, will rise and fall. There's a rising and a falling, and the lowest fall of the galactic center in the southern skies occurs right around now. It's key to the galactic alignment. So its highest arc through the southern skies occurred half a precession cycle ago. So the myth that Atlantis started sinking is maybe a metaphor for the astronomical process by which the galactic center started falling lower and lower and lower. And then get this, it was around the time of Plato that it fell below the southern horizon from the latitude of Greece. So
then
it's like now Atlantis has sunk below the waves.
Okay, and so it's like now he's writing about it so that people may remember it because now they can't see it anymore, right? I mean,
he probably got his information from his Egyptian informants.
yeah, that's what he said, that it was like his grandpa learned about it in Egypt, who learned about it from some priest, and it was like 300-year-old knowledge.
But he probably didn't understand the true reference it. He was relating the sort of legend around it.
Which had been passed down for quite a long time.
Right, which turned into kind of just a fairy tale story.
So Atlantis then would be like, oh, at its peak, when it was up there, we were all privy to this high perennial wisdom. We were all bathed in this light.
Right, right.
And now it's sunk, it's gone away, and now we're in darkness.
Right, and it's also like God has left the stage of history. So we get in our own monotheistic religion this idea that God set things in motion and then he disappeared and just left humanity, at least that's one aspect of the Christian thing.
The thing that you put forth too is that it's almost very obvious if you look at the night sky that over time people can kind of piece this together. So what made Western culture lose it so much? Just all that basically, what was it what you said about that it kind of gave power to the feminine, and it talked about our connection with the cosmos, and that's sort of what
Well, these things in the sky became objects of scientific mapping.
Right.
And we see this shift very clearly in the work of Johannes Kepler, right around the year 1600. His book was called Mysterium Cosmographicum. Mm-hmm. Cosmographicum means that we're going to map the cosmos.
Right.
Whereas the older term cosmos logos means we're going to understand the cosmos.
Okay.
So science is preoccupied with mapping things. So
as opposed to knowing things.
Right. Cosmos knowledge, logos knowledge.
Huh.
So there's a real shift in emphasis on what an object of knowledge is, what it is to know something. And science took on the position that if you can map it out and label it, then you would know it. But clearly that's kind of a false sense of certainty around understanding the cosmos. See, what happened in this cosmological shift with the discovery of Copernicus, that our sun is the center of the solar system, we gained a more accurate mapping ability, but we lost sort of the whole picture of it. We sort of lost the sense of our relationship to the cosmos.
Right.
And so because of that, any kind of relationship that we might have with the changing angles in our sky to the galaxy and so on, just didn't really make that much sense. The only place you see it preserved is in the Neoplatonic traditions, and even there it's very fragmented. By the time of Greece and the time of Rome and early Christianity, I think that this knowledge of the galactic center was basically lost and buried. It probably came through into Babylonia from ancient Egypt and was probably around at the time of Homer. In fact, there's a sort of a model in Homer's book, The Odyssey, that was written about 800 BC. It's a metaphor. It's sort of a literary allegory that talks about the cave of the nymphs. And this has to do with the cyclic process of the soul coming into incarnation and then exiting incarnation, returning back to paradise. And the two gateways in the sky where this happens, one is the cross of the Milky Way in the ecliptic on one side of the sky, and the place where the soul exits incarnation to return to paradise is the cross of the Milky Way in the ecliptic right at the galactic center, right at the dark rift. The cross.
Yeah, so this kind of great cross in the sky. I mean, that's just everywhere, right? I mean, that's just like all throughout history and symbolism and everything.
Yeah.
So what are the major players? The eclipse, or the plane of the Milky Way?
Yeah, the two arms of the cross. One axis is the ecliptic, which is the path followed by the sun, moon, and planets, and then crossing over that at a 60-degree angle is the Milky Way.
And is it just an amazing coincidence that lines up right at the nuclear bulge, or I guess any which way the solar system happened to be aligned?
Well, that's really a good question, Sean. the fact that the ecliptic crosses through the Milky Way at the region of the nuclear bulge is really interesting. There's no principle or law in nature that says that the ecliptic has to pass through the Milky Way right where the galactic center is located. This has to do with the plane of our solar system versus the plane of our galaxy. Why would they be linked up right where doesn't that suggest some kind of entrainment principle that the galactic center is some kind of energetic vortex that is causing the plane of our solar system to orient itself towards the galactic center?
Yeah, they're somehow connected because it just seems like astronomically, or are they exactly perfect, or is it just like a slight degree off that they?
Well, they're off a little bit. They're not right precisely on.
So it never, as far as we know, will ever actually infinitely perfectly line up, but it gets pretty damn close, right?
Yeah.
And so these are crazy houses.
Yeah, Colonial Campestre.
What does that mean?
That's the hotel. Can we go to that Colonial Campestre?